What should our dumb intro bit be for this episode?
I am a vampire.
And I have to redo.
I am a vampire.
I could just include that Kim Yaw Dawson song with no explanation, but it's not really it's not really a bit. It's just more of a
stealing,
putting a thing in front. What's a marriage joke?
What we do in the shadows, marriage.
Should it be a bit on that Princess Bride thing everyone loves?
Which marriage?
Yeah,
is what brings us together today.
Yeah, and
love. A true love.
And then we insert some reference to Crimson Vow.
And blood? True blood.
Perfect. Hello and welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. I'm your host, Andy. I'm here with my co-host, Anthony, brand new craftsperson, woodsworker, carpenter extraordinaire, Maddox. I had the idea of the nickname. I clearly didn't have the actual wording worked out, and I just kind of went for it.
I've learned important skills about woodworking, like catching offcuts and vacuuming.
So Josh basically did the work for you,
yes,
and
yes.
But it was still a fun project to do together. I heard that you invented an ingenious way to cut the top or something.
I did. I did make a small contribution. I said, "What if we cut it this way first?" And Josh said, "Good idea."
It worked
great.
There you go. For those not in the know, Anthony is working on his brand new personal basic land station for his home.
I think it's really important that every home has, certain things, towels, hand soap, and a basic land box.
You gotta have a basic land station.
You gotta have everything that your guests are going to need.
This is not a basic land box. This is a basic land station.
Basic land station, sure. Yeah. It's going to be great.
You already have a basic land box. I'm sure you have a couple basic land boxes.
Well, I do have
here.
boxes of basic lands.
Yeah, see,
that's
not
true,
the same. Not the same. You got to be splayed out, Wooburg order.
Exactly. You get space for tokens. We did. It's really hard to understand proportions of things before you design a box, so it's a little bit deeper than I meant it to be. It will probably hold about 5 commander decks, so maybe it just turns into the commander box. But
that's an interesting idea too.
It's a multi-purpose box. It was a fun project.
I think it's funny that you are always embracing the cheapest possible boxes. You love carrying your cube around in Ziploc bags and trash bags and stuff.
That's a little bit extreme. I respect my cards. I do the minimum necessary to protect them.
But you do genuinely have basically all of your cards in cardboard boxes, pretty
Correct.
much, like the cheap BCW, various size boxes. And then, what gets the nice walnut custom-made box is the basic land station.
I think that makes perfect.
We all have our values. We all have our values.
Sense.
Anthony.
Basic lands are forever. I can invest in a beautiful box. I'm gonna have a new cube next month. I'm gonna change the size. I'm gonna, I don't know, just give up on cube altogether in a month.
Hold on a sec. Wait a minute. Hold on. Time out. That's gonna mess up our podcast. I think if you give up on cube, unless you invent something way better and cooler than cube, and that'll be a huge boon for our podcast.
Hypercube. I'll be right back.
I'm hungry, Jerry. We've already dilly-dallied too much because this is the first of our Crimson Vow set review episodes. We're doing this a little differently this time around. The set review episode we've done in the past for each set is ordered kind of generally speaking in the color order and kind of touches on our evaluations of cards, touches on the community's evaluations of cards, touches on a bunch of things. And, it's modeled after other set reviews, which are largely written for Limited or Constructed, which don't really apply to Cube in the exact same structure. So here's what we're going to try this time around. This episode is our mechanics episode, mechanics theme cycle episode that we've done for the past few sets, and we'll continue to do pretty much unchanged. So we're going to be talking about all things Crimson Vow except for individual cards in this episode. And we're going to talk about them in a more broad, abstract sense in the hopes that you can apply whatever our conversation is to your own environments, whatever they may be. Then we're going to do an episode, a new style episode, that is all about just the cards that Anthony and I are adding to our own cubes, respectively, from the new set. So think of that like a set review, but we're really just touching on the cards that are interesting to us. And this is really to acknowledge the fact that cube design always happens in a context, right? You can't evaluate cards in a vacuum, and so we're going to explicitly set the context of our own cubes to talk about the cards in that episode. And then the third episode will be dedicated directly to the community feedback. On that point, we do have our survey for Crimson Vow up, so check out luckypaper.co/survey/VOW to fill out that survey. It's got all of the Crimson Vow Commander cards on the same survey, so just one survey to fill out. And we're also soliciting hot takes for the community review episode, the third episode for the set, which will come out in a couple weeks. So send us your hot takes, voice memos to mail@luckypaper.co, or you can get at me on Discord and just send them to me via DMs. Parker pointed out this is a really good way to kind of call your shot. If you have some hot take about a card, or you think it's going to be great or terrible in the future, and you think everyone's wrong about it, the only way to canonically enshrine that take, well, I mean, I guess you could put it in an envelope and mail it to yourself and leave it sealed with, the postmaster stamp on it to like date it, or you could just send it to me in a voice memo and it gets enshrined forever in the podcast. And you can always point back and say, look, there's my hot take about Unholy Heat. I told you it was going to be sick, and no one believed me.
If you want the best of both those worlds, record it, put it on a cassette, and put that in an envelope and send it to us.
And mail it to me. And then I will go buy a tape player. I don't even think I have anything in my life that can play a CD or a DVD, so, I mean, a tape cassette player is far away. Actually, I think my wife has one of those, actually. She likes tapes. Did I summarize that well enough, Anthony?
You did a great job.
Does that make sense for our sort of changed approach to set reviews? So we're going to have abstract game design discussion, mechanics, themes, cycles of the set on this episode. Next episode is set review in the context of our specific environments and the cards we're interested in. So the context is set. And then the third episode is dedicated kind of explicitly to the community's reaction to the set and the cards that people are most interested in across the Cube landscape.
And I think that's really important because sometimes we've gotten a little bit lost in those long set review episodes and missed a little bit of the emphasis on that community response. And we really want to frame that and make sure that that gets the attention it deserves.
Yeah, and also I think kind of jumping back and forth between here's a card I like for my cube for these reasons, and here's a card that ranked highly on the set review survey for X reasons can be kind of jarring, and people kind of get lost in the context. Context is so important.
Context.
It's important to everything we talk about here on the show, and so we think this format will help emphasize that context in all of our episodes. So we're going to try this for maybe at least the next couple sets and see how it goes, see how people like it. Obviously, everything is subject to change in the future if we think of something even better.
Hypercube.
Shall we dive directly into the Crimson Vow mechanics?
Let's do it. I'm excited about the set.
I am too. This set's got some good stuff and it's got some stuff that's a little bit of a letdown. We'll get to all the things, though, in this episode. First up is training. Anthony, training is a triggered ability on creatures that says whenever this creature attacks with another creature with greater power, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. It is kind of like the opposite of Mentor, which is the mechanic that says when this creature attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on a creature with lesser power, it's also attacking. So this mechanic goes on the smaller creature as opposed to the bigger creature. Kind of makes sense. Mentor, training, it all kind of fits. There are 9 cards in Crimson Vow with training, which is actually not that many. I kind of expected more. Only 9 cards is not a ton. What do you think of this mechanic?
You know I'm going to like this mechanic. I mean, it's got +1/+1 counters. It encourages combat. It makes you care about the power of your creatures. It just does a lot of cool stuff that I just really enjoy basic Magic in a lot of ways. But that being said, I'm a little bit less excited about it, honestly, compared to Mentor. It's an obvious parallel. They do very similar things. They have kind of similar play patterns. But what I think I actually really liked about Mentor was the power was in the creature that was giving away counters. So it meant that in combat, very often you'd end up trading that creature off because your opponent wanted to block it, and then you'd end up still getting that sort of bonus of that counter left behind, which I think isn't quite going to work out as well as on training. We also see a bunch of these cards have like pretty big butts, which means they're just going to attack wantonly and get counters, and that feels a little bit less interactive in terms of just like the combat mechanics. More importantly, what I really like about Mentor is it lets you kind of mix and match where you put the counters with other keyword abilities or just other creatures in general. So say you have a flyer or a creature with double strike, you could Mentor and actually power those creatures up. I think that for those ratings, training is a little bit more narrow, but I expect some of these cards are going to be appealing in a lot of low-powered environments regardless.
Yeah, that's true what you said. I think it's a big important thing to mention, which is that because the creature with the keyword ability is the one getting the counter with training, there's not as many opportunities to do something interesting or novel by putting a counter on a creature, because all these cards were designed with the understanding they would have counters put on them. So you can't Mentor onto your Swiftblade Vindicator or your Dreadhorde Arcanist or whatever kind of card that has interesting power matters stuff that you would otherwise do with the Mentor ability. I think there's another difference between this and Mentor, which is that one way that it's actually maybe more interesting or it creates some more interesting decisions, which is that if you think of a board state where you have a small creature and a big creature, and in one scenario you have Mentor on the big creature, and in one scenario you have training on the small creature. Effectively, those board states are the same. If you attack with both creatures, the small creature gets a +1/+1 counter. I think when the big creature has Mentor and your opponent has removal, it's a no-brainer. Obviously, I'm going to kill the big creature with the keyword ability. It's going to increase the power of other things. But when you have a valuable keyword ability on the small creature, then it does open up this possibility where it's like, well, maybe instead of just trying to keep all these big creatures off the board so this creature can never train up, I'm just going to kill the thing with training. Maybe that comes up. So I kind of like that it diversifies potentially the threat of the cards on board, but ultimately I agree. I think Mentor plays more interestingly and has more opportunities for interesting design space than training does.
Although something you touched on there is sort of the sequencing, which I think that was another place that maybe could be a little bit weak with Mentor, where if you had your one Mentor creature and then you kind of wanted to like not use all your mana to play a smaller creature, like you could get into weird situations, whereas training is just like, yeah, put the biggest thing you can in play because it's going to power up your training creatures. And I could see that sort of like leading to more natural sequences. And then again, maybe those unnatural sequences are actually some of the more interesting decision points. So
yeah, I think in some ways like unnatural and interesting are maybe synonymous in the ways we talk about them in this context. This probably won't come up a bunch, but it is worth noting that Mentor had some maybe slightly complicated under the surface rules stuff in that it checked the power of both creatures both when the ability triggered and also on resolution of the ability, and if something had happened in the intervening time to decrease the power of the Mentor creature or increase the power of the mentee, then the Mentor counter wouldn't actually end up on that small creature. And training does not work that way. Training is a very simple, just triggered ability. It does not matter what happens to the bigger creature. It can get removed with that ability on the stack. It can get its power reduced to 0. You can play a combat trick on the small creature, whatever. That +1/+1 counter is still going to end up on the small creature, assuming it's still around to get it, which is a little bit nice. That has come up, I think, in some places where the Mentor ability is a little bit trickier than maybe is intuitive, and training is not. It plays out pretty simply.
Evolve does the same thing, and it always annoys me. Like, why do we have to check twice?
Yeah, there's reasons, I'm sure. Matt Tabak could tell us. Overall, I agree. I like this mechanic a lot. It's very simple and touches on things that a lot of cubes will care about. If you care about combat, if you care about +1/+1 counters, if you care about the power mattering of creatures, this all comes into play. For the reasons you mentioned, I think it has a little bit less interesting design and novel deck building space than Mentor did. So if you weren't high on Mentor creatures, you're probably not going to be super high on any of these training creatures for your own cube or for the mechanic for your own cube. Both of these mechanics, I think, are a little bit of win-more mechanics in that they require you to have 2 creatures you can at least reasonably attack with in order for them to do anything, which pros and cons there. I think there are probably some circumstances where the existence of the training keyword allows you to attack where before you couldn't, but I think a lot of times this is going to be, I already had 2 good attacks, now my 2 good attacks are even better, and also this creature's going to get better in the process. And so I do think it has this kind of snowballing potential, where if you have, a 3/1 and a 1-powered creature with training, over a couple turns, that 1-powered creature is going to get a little bit out of hand. And I think reasonably some players avoid this kind of snowballing gameplay where like threats just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and that can happen with this mechanic, I think.
I think that we're expanding the definition a little bit much for my taste if we call this win more to have 2 creatures in play and the opportunity to attack. I think in a lot of contexts, like especially if we think about the power level retail limited, that's just not a situation where you're like definitely winning and this is snowballing.
Well,
I think likely you're gonna.
It's not necessarily definitely winning. It's just a quadrant theory thing of like you're probably ahead if you're attacking with 2 creatures.
But I mean, I could also see there being interesting situations where you don't have a great attack, but you end up sort of needing to attack because getting that counter is going to mean that you're winning the race in the next turn. So I can see that sort of risk evaluation coming into play.
That's the question: is how often that'll be the case, or how often it's just going to be, well, obviously I attack and get this free gravy for already attacking my opponent, which is what I already wanted to be doing, and now my board just gets better because of it.
Or do you just attack bluffing a combat trick?
You could do that too, Anthony. Your favorite thing to do. But we can agree in like the quadrant theory world, this is not a good mechanic when you're behind. If you're blocking, this mechanic doesn't do anything. So you have to be attacking your opponent. You have to be attacking them with at least 2 creatures in order for this mechanic to even function.
That is a fact.
The only other thing I'll say about this is we've talked a lot about how in multiplayer cube lists, we like to encourage combat. And this is, as you said, another mechanic that does just encourage combat. Now, again, I think it's going to be worse at this than Mentor. I can imagine situations in a multiplayer cube where the value of the +1/+1 counter I'm putting on a creature might be much greater than just +1/+1 to power and toughness because I'm doing something else with that counter or for some other reason. And that's not going to happen with training for the most part, again, because all these cards are designed with the expectation they will have +1/+1 counters put on them. So not a lot of broken stuff to do with putting a counter on a training creature because it was designed to do that. But it does encourage combat if you are trying to push that in a multiplayer cube. As we know, multiplayer environments tend to naturally just reward sitting back on your heels, building up your engine, and not actually being proactive. Next up, Anthony, is Cleave. This is a new kicker split card mechanic. It only appears on instants and sorceries, and it basically says if a spell is cast for its Cleave cost, which is separate from its mana cost, then you look at the rules text and remove bracketed text within the rules text of the card. There's 12 cards in Crimson Vow with this mechanic. We first saw this mechanic in the Mystery Booster playtest cards, and now we have it in real life.
I've had a real roller coaster trying to gauge my own feelings with Cleave, and I suspect I'm not the only one here. This is one of the most subtly bizarre mechanics we've seen in so long. I mean, we've seen double-face cards and mutate and all kinds of insane stuff, and they just put some brackets in the text box, but it's like so weird and meta and just like actually about the game pieces more than it is about this sort of metaphor of being a spellcasting wizard that it kind of just feels clunky to me, I think, in the end.
Yeah, I don't have mixed feelings about Cleave. I really dislike this mechanic. My takeaway from this is just because you can doesn't mean you should, is what I wrote down here about Cleave.
Or should you a little bit and then decide it's bad?
It was fun to do in the Mystery Booster playtest cards. I kind of feel like the resolution after that should have been, well, this is actually just worse than doing a normal split card.
Was there actually a Cleave card in those?
Yeah, there was. It wasn't called Cleave. It was called something else, but there was the bracketed text, remove it, do all that kind of stuff. So all of these cards that are Cleave cards could be written as cards with kicker, could be written as split cards, could be written as DFCs, although we don't have any DFCs that are both aces and sorceries on both sides. They're all always a permanent, at least on one side. So they could be written in a lot of other ways. I think it'll be a lot more clear. I think this is kind of the clunkiest possible implementation of this modal mechanic we've seen on any Magic cards. I think it's really difficult to parse. I misread many cards in spoiler season the first time through, just
absolutely
naturally misread them, and then the second time through I still misread them and had to stop myself and say, actually think about this, figure it out. And honestly, I think WotC has kind of acknowledged a little bit of this complexity. There's only 2 cards at common with Cleave, and half of the cards with mechanics, 6 of them, 6 of the 12, are at rare. I think they know this mechanic does not actually play that well, and I can't help but feel like this is them really reaching for some more design space when actually we'd be better served by normal split card mechanics that already exist.
Yeah, I mean, that's a little bit of a negative way to spin it.
I don't like the mechanic. I'm being negative.
Clearly, they are exploring new space. I feel like this is very new space again, in that it's sort of referencing the actual card text in a way that we haven't seen before. I mean, maybe we should mention Overload a little bit, but even Overload does feel much more natural. Like, oh, I'm going to cast my spell, but bigger. Like that's a thing that I can put into that metaphor much more easily than, redacting some components of it. I do think it's definitely interesting space, and the idea that, you can change something not by adding something to it, but by removing. But what it does boil down to is a lot of these mechanics just have sort of restrictions or downsides that end up getting removed in a way that, we could also implement in like a kicker or any of those other sort of types of spells that are a lot easier to parse. I do appreciate in a big way the Indicate card, the Cloven Vindicates that someone made, where they just put brackets around the V and the Destroy, so it's just Indicate, target permanent, which I know is a joke that we've seen before, but doing the Cleave treatment, that's perfect. But yeah, that was the highlight for me, was this joke card that someone made. Too. Beyond that, I don't really need Cleave in my life.
I saw some people defending this, basically saying, it's easy, just, look at it and take out the bracketed text. And of course, I know how the mechanic works, right? I know what I'm supposed to do. People aren't.
You're not that stupid.
Well, I mean,
you're not completely unable to do it.
There are some mechanics that are complicated enough that even experienced players might not literally know what they should do, even with reading all the rules text. And here, that's not the case. This mechanic is simple. If you read the card says what the card does. It's very straightforward.
Right.
I have a background in graphic design, Anthony. You have also studied graphic design a bit. In typography, that process of typesetting, we talk a lot about this distinction between legibility and readability, which, if you're not familiar with this world, might sound like synonyms, but legibility in this context means you can actually see the words, you can make out what the letters are, you can actually physically read the thing. And so something that has really, really low contrast or, has glare on it or is too small to be visible by people with poor sight would be illegible. You literally have no hope of determining what letters you're looking at on the page. Readability, in contrast, has nothing to do with legibility. It assumes a legible text, and it basically says, given a legible text, how readable is this, right? Because you can set a novel in impact font if you want, and it's legible. You can look at every word and figure out what the words are and read it, but it's going to be awful to read a whole novel set in impact for all sorts of complicated typography reasons. And to me, this mechanic is very legible. Sure, I know what the cards do. It's not hard to figure it out, but it's really unreadable. This, the fact that the modes are intertwined instead of being written out as 2 separate modes, like mode 1, mode 2, it's just they're mixed together and you have to figure out what words to ignore, what words to not ignore. I think it makes it really hard to just parse these cards quickly. And I think that is a problem.
I think it is as well. And for a lot of people that are designing cubes, they sort of just don't think about this kind of complexity and grokkability at all. That's just not a concern because they know their players are enfranchised and know all the cards. But I think that in a lot of contexts, that is not something that we should be taking for granted. Somebody was just talking on the Discord about individual packs taking 30 minutes to draft. And it's not that each player can't read and understand every card, but when you're being handed 15 cards that are all these crazy effects, that complexity does add up in a meaningful way. And if your draft is taking too long, or if players are just making mistakes because they're focused on just trying to do this thing, which they can do, but it is taking too much effort to understand what the cards do, that is a real downside to the game.
Yeah, it does affect the actual gameplay. People will punt more often, and people will just say, I'm not going to try and figure out what that card does because it's too complicated, so I'm not even going to pick it in this pack, even though it's in my colors. I'm just going to pay attention to these cards that I know and understand. It does affect the actual gameplay. The other thing I wanted to compare this to is I actually looked up what this is called for the first time in my life. Have you ever heard of the Stroop effect?
Does it have to do with waffles?
It does not have to do with waffles,
Then no.
Unfortunately. I wish it did. It'd be much more fun to talk about. No, you ever seen one of those, I don't even know what to call them, puzzles, I guess, where there's a word, and the word is spelling out a color word, like red, but then the word is set in a different color, like the word red is set in green text.
Yes.
And you have to go down a list and say either just what the word says or what the color that the text is written in is, and how difficult it is to do quickly because your brain is seeing red and you have to say green, or vice versa, and it's kind of weird.
It's really hard.
That's called the Stroop effect, and that's something else I thought of when I saw this mechanic. It's just ignore the bracketed text. It's I understand. Sure.
But my body is so used to reading. I want to read the words.
I'm so used to looking at the rules of Magic cards, and the words on the Magic card have always all mattered, right? That's how Magic cards have always been, and now you're telling me that some of these words I should actively ignore, and it's really hard to break that pattern, I think, and in the same way that it's hard to break the pattern of your brain just wanting to read the colors it sees.
For me, it's even worse. I read it, we hit the square brackets, all of a sudden my brain's like, okay, we're reading Objective C now, but that's not the case. It's still a Magic card.
Yeah, I totally understand. All right, I don't love Cleave. Is there anything else you have to say about it?
I think it's fine they tried it. We have a very small number of cards here in the set, and I think that is evidence that there is maybe not a ton of design space for this mechanic, and that's fine.
Yeah, there are more cards with Cleave than Training, but there are more commons with Training than Cleave. I expect the Asfan of Training is quite a bit higher than the Asfan of Cleave, given that half the Cleave cards are all at rare.
Right, which isn't something that for a lot of cube designers really matters, but I think it does really sort of give us a little bit insight into the thought process behind these designs.
It tells you what WotC thinks of this mechanic. If it was a great bread and butter, easy to understand mechanic, they would probably use it on a lot of commons because they got to fill the file with something, and so if they have an opportunity to fill it with a great mechanic, they will. This one seems to me like it was kind of well, we're going to try it, see what happens. Last note on this, I can't imagine what this is like for the translation team.
Oh my God.
It's got to be a nightmare, right? The fact that this mechanic works with specific wordings in rules text, how are they going to translate that? I mean, they obviously thought of this. I'm not sure how they're going to translate that to all different languages. It's got to be kind of a mess.
I'm sure there was a hard conversation.
Is there even the idea of square brackets in Chinese?
I'm pretty sure there is.
I have no clue. Absolutely no clue. Maybe it's a whole different thing. I don't know. We'll find out, I guess, when we see all of the cards of different languages. On to a mechanic I really love, Anthony, blood tokens. This is a new artifact trinket token in the spirit of clues and food tokens, and they're artifact tokens with the ability 1, tap, discard a card, sacrifice this artifact, draw a card. So there are no blood cards, but there are cards that make these blood tokens, and there are 30 of them in Crimson Vow and 5 of them in the Crimson Vow Commander product. So a lot more than the previous mechanics we saw. What do you think of blood tokens?
So I also feel a little bit mixed about blood tokens. I do really enjoy these kinds of trinkety artifact tokens that, they've been doing increasingly. We had gold a little bit a long time ago, and then they created Investigate with clues, and then Treasure kind of made a big thing. And I think Wizards Design has really realized these kinds of tokens that are not creatures, but are just little effects that you can spend later on in the game actually are a really interesting knob to adjust on a lot of cards. And I think this looting effect is a perfect sort of extension of this, another great little fit. However, why is it called a blood token? I feel like the flavor is so off, and this should be a clue token, and blood should deal a damage and gain a life, I think?
Okay, so I asked this on the Discord in preparation for this show because I wanted to know if anybody had a take about this as to how this would work. And Sam Consumes Pie from the MTG Cube Discord had a good explanation for me, which was basically so the idea is blood as food. You're drinking the blood.
Uh-huh.
And so what's happening is...
Okay, wait, but we already have food tokens, so those gain life.
Blood as sustenance. Sorry for not choosing a synonym for food. So you are like, as a non-vampire, drinking the blood, which costs you a little bit of your sanity to become a little more of a vampire. You discard a card, right? That's been a synonymous in Magic flavor with like, coming unhinged or like, losing your mind. And then you replace that with a card draw because you're now like entering the vampire fold. You get some reward for becoming more vampiric. It's a little bit of a stretch, but I see where it came from, and I like it a little more now that I have that lens.
I like it a little bit more as well. Still grinding my gears.
I think what you said about this mechanic, giving them a lot of knobs to adjust in design and development, is my favorite thing about it. It's these little tiny incremental advantages where like, this is way worse than putting draw a card on a card. This is worse than putting a clue token into play. It's another like incremental way to add some additional value to some card that otherwise would be really hard to just like tack on a little value to a spell or effect somewhere, which I think is great. Basically what these do pretty much is give a card in your hand cycling one is the best way to think about it for me. It's a rummaging, not a loot. So you have to discard the card first as part of the cost and then draw the card as a result of the effect. So you can't do this with an empty hand, which is important. You're not discarding the card as part of the resolution. You have to discard as part of the cost. So at first, my initial reaction was like, oh, this seems kind of narrow. Not every deck wants to rummage, which is true. Not every deck wants to commit spells to the idea of rummaging, because if you're not using the graveyard too substantially to your advantage, then rummaging is oftentimes not a great use of mana. But here, these are all tacked onto other existing effects. So again, giving something in your hand, just cycling one, is kind of a cool ability to just have stapled onto another card that does something else.
Also the opportunity for these tokens, which are generated kind of incidentally in a lot of effects, to interact with anything that cares about artifacts or draw and discard, and just has a lot of other places for other mechanics to fit into it.
Yeah, and in that sense, I think it's a great boon for cube designers. If you have things that are looking for discard outlets, that means every card that makes a blood token is also a discard outlet. It's also an artifact for your artifact matter stuff. Like you said, it touches on a lot of aspects of the game and offers a lot of opportunity for drafting and building around and building around in a cube.
I'm still going to be hung up on the name, though, because Investigate and Food just feel,
they're much
Clue
more
Food.
straightforward.
They're more straightforward, and they feel more evergreen. I feel like anybody can make a food and gain you some life in kind of any context, whereas this feels very specific.
Is there a plane without food?
I would guess Mirrodin, if anything. At least New Mirrodin.
Possibly.
New Phyrexia, I should call it. I
guess there's probably blood on every plane, too. But it is like a vial of blood is the thing. Like, it's not like just some blood on the ground. Imagine a blood token. It's just like a puddle of blood on the ground.
Oh, man. I'd love to see the set of tokens. Very nicely illustrated of just what a puddle of blood looks like on every different plane.
Oh, there you go. There's an art project for somebody out there. Anyway, I like blood tokens. I think they're cool. I really like these very small incremental advantage mechanics. And I do like the ones that basically say not only do you get a small effect, but you don't even get the small effect now. You get the small effect some point later in the game whenever you're willing to pay to activate this token. I think that adds a lot of texture to the gameplay, which I'm a big fan of.
I agree. I also would even say that there are a lot of other cards that just interact with permanents or artifacts in a general way, like sacrifice an artifact to get a bonus. And sacrificing a clue is kind of a big expense because you're down a card, essentially, if the game is going to go longer and you're going to be able to use it. Whereas losing a cycling one is something where you're maybe more willing to actually use that blood token for other purposes.
For a costly plunder or whatever.
Exactly. So I kind of like the way that this fits into a lot of things, and I'm really excited to see how that plays out.
Yeah. We have 3, maybe 4, based on my notes here, returning mechanics to Crimson Vow. The first is just Daybound and Nightbound. We talked about this at length with Midnight Hunt, and there's no real mechanical change here to any of the Daybound or Nightbound cards. It's basically more of the same. Do you feel like we have to return to this at all? There's 14 more cards in this set with Daybound and Nightbound on them.
I would just say go listen to our previous fantastic episode. It's a great listen.
Yeah, my feelings on this mechanic have not changed with these new cards, so I think we can just refer people to that. Disturb, however, is also back, but it is back with some slight mechanical differences. So Disturb we see come back with 13 cards in Crimson Vow, no cards in the Commander product. This, again, is that mechanic that we were previously kind of describing as a like flashback for creatures. In Midnight Hunt, it was primarily, if not exclusively, used on creature cards that then came back as spirit versions of themselves, usually with flying and a spirit creature type. Here in Crimson Vow, all of these Disturb cards start out as creatures, and then return as auras. Mostly creature auras, a curse or two, but they return as these enchantment auras. And so, honestly, I think this is actually most similar to Haunt, the Orzhov mechanic from the original Ravnica block, where basically it was a creature that when it died, it haunted another creature in play, and that basically triggered something based on the card that was haunting it. So these basically come back as auras. In most cases, the aura seems to have a design connection to the front face of the card. So some of the abilities of the creature on the front face will be embodied in the aura or something like that. What do you think of this new interpretation of Disturb?
Similar to the previous Disturb cards, I think that this is one of the better implementations of double face cards. And I think that calling back Haunt is actually a really good example of a mechanic that's really hard to do without double face cards. I think that here double face cards are actually really meaningful. They're not just adding complexity because there's an opportunity to add complexity and they should try it, but they're, trying to implement a kind of flavor and a kind of gameplay that's hard to do without it. I do, again, like that, similar to the previous Disturb cards, they're pretty grokkable. Generally, not quite as consistently, but generally they're doing something similar to what the front face is doing, granting that to a creature, whether it's, an attack trigger that now is granted to another creature or a power and toughness. Another mechanic that I think is interesting to call back to, just in terms of the sort of the way that you understand this kind of parallel ability, is Blood Rush, where it was a mechanic where you could discard a creature card, and it would always grant that creature's power and toughness and other abilities to a creature as basically a combat trick. And it's a similar thing where you have this kind of modal card, but there's that parallel which makes it very easy to understand, which, especially when we're talking about double face cards and a lot of information is hidden, I think really goes a long way to making the cards play well and be understandable.
Yeah, I agree. Something we've said before about the double face cards is that I think you and I generally don't love them, but I think the implementations that make more sense to us are ones where there is this natural gameplay pattern where the second mode becomes relevant, where it's not just you have an extra invisible card in your hand that you can't see till you flip a card around on the sleeve. It's actually that you're going to play this thing as the front side always, and then when it dies, you get this additional ability, and that's how these all play out. I will say that I liked the original Midnight Hunt implementation of Disturb a little more than this new implementation, just because I thought it was even cleaner. Again, just to basically say it's flashback for creatures that come back a little better at a higher cost for their Disturb cost. Here, I think it's a little clunkier to understand. What I do like about this, though, is we've talked before about how cards like Barb Spike and Ancestral Blade allow you to increase your artifact and equipment density in a deck that has an artifact or equipment theme without sacrificing creature spells, because you don't want to be stuck with a deck that's full of nothing but equipment and has no creatures to put them on. And in a similar way, I think that these cards for players that care about a Voltron or a Boggles or an Enchantress deck allow you to get a density of auras and enchantments without having to sacrifice creatures. It's not quite the same here because you don't get that aura or enchantment until the creature's already died or been discarded and cast from your graveyard for its Disturb cost, but it does still put on a single card these two different card types in your deck for decks that care about those types of cards.
I think that is super relevant, though, and going along with that is the fact that a lot of these creatures are just costed to be very cheap, so that you're likely to be able to play them in the early game and actually get that advantage, to the very extreme point of some of these cards, which just, go to the graveyard on their own just by attacking with them. So there's a very reasonable chance of actually being able to use that effect.
Yeah.
The last thing I'd say about this new sort of implementation of Disturb is I do really like the sort of extension of the flavor. Previously, we had creatures that turned into spirits. Now we have spirits that just sort of kind of leave behind their spiritual essence and sort of, they're still doing that thing, but not really creatures anymore, which is kind of a nice, I think I love when that flavor actually just makes things more fun and more understandable.
I didn't even notice that. So are the creatures with Disturb in this set primarily or all spirits?
They are all spirits as far as I can see.
There you go. I did not pick up on that, but that makes sense. So we started with non-spirit creatures that turned into spirit creatures that now turn into just some magical cloud, man. Just some stuff floating around, some magical dust. Before we leave Disturb completely, I do want to talk about the sort of fourth returning mechanic here, which is just double face cards. Without looking up on Scryfall, Anthony, do you want to guess how many DFCs are in Crimson Vow?
There are a bunch. I'm going to guess 50.
There are 49 cards in Crimson Vow. Yeah, and so this includes all of the Disturb cards, all of the Daybound, Nightbound cards, and then 22 other cards that are also DFCs but don't have Disturb or Daybound, Nightbound on them. These all transform in different ways. None of them, I don't think, unless I missed one, are cast other side DFCs where you just have two modes. You can cast them either way. They're all cards that come into play on their front side and then transform by some other way. They have rule text on them. It says transform them, or ability you can pay to transform them. And yeah, I mean, we've talked about double face cards before. We don't have to go over it all again, but I wish this wasn't apparently an evergreen thing. I don't mind double face cards every now and then, but basically every iteration I've seen of them has been less and less to my taste. The ones with just the non-basic lands on the back, I think, were the cleanest example of this, and they've just gotten clunkier, I think, as time has gone on.
Yeah, I mean, the transforming double-face cards, I think, are a very different ballgame than the modal double-face cards. And I think especially if we were seeing them together in the same set,
oh boy,
that's something that they're definitely staying away from, and I think that's a good idea.
Yeah. The last returning mechanic is Exploit. This is an opportunity to talk about a mechanic we have not talked about at length, because this originally came out on some Cons block set.
I believe this was a Ravnica block.
Was it Ravnica block? This came out in a set long before we started this podcast, so we have not done a set review where we talked about Exploit. This is a triggered ability on creatures that allows you to sacrifice a creature on ETB to gain some effect. It is a May, so you don't have to do it, and there are 9 cards in Crimson Vow with Exploit on them. I don't know what your thoughts are on Exploit, Anthony. What do you think about this mechanic?
Well, my first thought is I think you're right. It was a Concept Tarkir block.
Ooh, God, love being right.
For some reason, I think when they were spoiling it, they said specifically like a faction mechanic was coming back. So I had it in my mind. I was really hoping it was going to be Surveil.
Hey, no Johns,
but...
baby, no Johns. That's a Smash Brothers reference.
Okay.
There was one guy named John that complained a lot when he lost, and so it became a whole thing to say no Johns when you were like trying to make some excuse.
Is that just the history of Johns? First they complain and they get the toilet named after them, then they complain and something about Super Smash Brothers.
I think it's great that the entire community calls it no Johns and don't John, and it's just one complaining dude.
Poor guy. I think Exploit is a very reasonable mechanic. It's almost like there's so many other mechanics that are similarly just you sacrifice a creature and get an effect that it almost doesn't really make sense to me to set aside a big like section to be like, what do we think of Exploit? Because do you want to sacrifice stuff? If so, great. Here's another way to do it.
Well, I don't think it's just that. I've been trying really hard to look at even returning mechanics with like my new eyes to try and like look at them again for the first time. And I do like that this is a modal mechanic in like at least 2 ways, right? So one of the ways it's modal is you can choose to sacrifice something or not, right? So you can choose just to get this creature with whatever body it has, whatever stats it has, or you can choose to exploit something and get this additional ability. And then the other important thing here is that the kind of second mode is you can choose to exploit the creature itself, which basically turns it into a sorcery, right? Where you just pay some mana and get some effect by sacrificing its own creature. Or, of course, you can have some sort of build around. You can have something going on in your deck that makes you want to sacrifice other things, in which case you can get even more value off of it. And I think a lot of these cards, in theory, should be perfectly playable outside of any kind of dedicated sacrifice deck, just as modal cards that, almost like Evoke, where it's like you can either cast this thing or you can evoke it, right? And you either get the effect or you get the body. And obviously, Exploit, you just get the body or the effect, where Evoke, you get the body and the effect if you cast it for its full mana cost. But it's just modal in that sense. And I think we'll actually see that Graph Reaver, I think is what it's called, the 3/3 that can exploit to kill a Planeswalker for 2 mana. I think that's a great example of a card that will be perfectly happy for a lot of people to play, even outside of any dedicated sacrifice strategies.
Definitely. I mean, there's a whole question of how much is this mechanic worth as like a component for a synergistic strategy, or just does this card have a reasonable floor? And any of these mechanics we can talk about, obviously, they can just tune all the other knobs and just make a card totally playable on its face.
Right.
And a 2 mana 3/3, what is this, a Carrion Feeder?
Sangrophage,
I
think, is the one.
There we go.
Because Carnophage is the 1 mana 2/2. Sangrophage
Mm-hmm.
is the 2 mana 3/3.
I have the picture in my brain.
It's a good picture. I think when you can make these mechanics that slot very specifically into narrower strategies, like an Aristocrat strategy, when you can make this mechanic playable on its own, with absent those strategies, then I think you have an interesting opportunity to like kind of do the kind of deck building I have associated with the regular cube, where it's like, I'm not going all in, right? I'm not an Aristocrat's deck, but I have this card, which has a reasonable floor. It has Exploit. And so that means that in the future, all of my little like self-recurring guys are going to get better. My opponent's pacifism-based removal is going to get worse, because now I can just sacrifice the thing and get pacified. I can get a threaten effect and combine that with Exploit to get a big swing in a turn if I want. And those are all things that I think if that's the dedicated strategy of your deck, it's kind of, to me, a bit of a bummer. Like if your deck is just about stealing stuff and sacrificing it, then it's like a kind of a one-note symphony. Mm-hmm. But if you have enough of these things floating around where it's like you could put that card in a variety of decks, not just that one narrow kind of deck, but you still get the opportunity to capitalize on those synergies when you draft and build around it appropriately, I think it's a good mechanic. And it's the first time I've talked about it. I like the Exploit mechanic, so...
Yeah, I agree. And I think that maybe more importantly than actually just seeing this mechanic is looking at the whole set more broadly. There are a ton of sort of graveyard-focused themes. And, even things like this Biolume egg that cares about when you sacrifice it, but doesn't have any way to sacrifice it. So the first time I read that, I was like, well, what's going on? But of course, we have, all these ways to sacrifice
got a bunch of vampires
creatures,
floating around, dude.
So I think that in that light, of course, it's a perfect fit of just being another way to interact with your board state and interact with your graveyard.
While we're talking about flavor, though, does it make sense that a creature can exploit itself? This was very
Absolutely
unintuitive to
not.
me when I first started playing Magic and learned what exploit was. I actually think I can remember the first time I was playing Commander and somebody cast that 5-mana Sidisi and exploited itself, and I was like, "Whoa, hold on, what are you talking about? Exploit itself? That makes no sense.
That's flavor fail.
That's not how exploiting works. You can't exploit yourself. You exploit someone else. That's what exploiting is."
It's definitely kind of a flavor fail. However, I don't know. I mean, I'm torn because part of Magic is discovering these weird edge cases and ways to combine effect and use things in unnatural ways. And that's a very clear case of it that I definitely also experienced early in my introduction to the game.
Yeah. I like the mechanic a lot more given that you can sacrifice the creature for the
agree.
reason I stated. It turns it into a self-contained modal card without any other necessary pieces. But maybe not my favorite named mechanic. Oh well. On to some cycles, Anthony. I want to talk about this cycle that I am just in love with. I think you know which one I'm talking about. This is the Cemetery cycle. This is a cycle of cards, one in each color, that all exile a card from a graveyard when they enter the battlefield. And the blue and green ones also do it on attack, and the black one does it when it dies. They exile cards from graveyards, basically. And then they provide some value based off of the mechanical details of the exiled card or cards. So the white one is Cemetery Protector, and it makes tokens when you play a card of the chosen type. The blue one is Cemetery Illuminator, and it lets you play cards of a chosen type or types off the top of your library. And this is one of the ones that lets you continue to exile cards, so you can add more cards to that type list. The black one is Cemetery Desecrator, which, it's got a lot of rules text. Basically plays out like Ravenous Cube Cobra that can also kill planeswalkers based on the mana value of whatever cards you exile. The red one, Cemetery Gatekeeper, is a symmetrical Punisher effect that deals 2 damage to anybody that plays a card with the exiled card's types. And then the green one is Cemetery Prowler, which gives you a discount on spells of the exiled types. Do you love this mechanic as much as I do? Or not mechanic. Do you love this cycle as much as I do?
I think, well, first of all, I would say this is definitely a mechanic. I think that it's very easy to get in this mindset of the things that are named are mechanics, but everything about
they
the
do
way...
all work a little differently is the problem. The black one doesn't
True.
reference card types. Some of them exile other times, not just from the ETB. It's not
I'm not saying it's a
hyper-consistent.
simple or consistent mechanic, but they could easily add a keyword ability to indicate all these creatures care about types of cards that they have exiled. I think that mechanic is very interesting. It's definitely asking you to care about something in a different way and care about sort of interacting with your opponents where maybe you want to exile something because your opponent, it has flashback or your opponent might be able to regrow it, but also you do actually have this other axis of trying to gain value by getting rid of the most number of different types of cards. So without playing these, these are the splashy mythics. I'm sure they're all going to be powerful. I'm definitely
interested. You say with disdain dripping off your tongue, you hate powerful cards.
I don't hate powerful cards. I just hate other people's joy in them.
That's so much healthier. That sounds great.
So I'm curious to see how these will play, and I think that's definitely interesting space to be playing with. I feel like we've seen that a little bit with Eldrazi processors and things that are caring about this exile zone in a new way, but that didn't really feel good. And this, because you're sort of building up a resource, actually makes a lot more sense to me.
Yeah, there's a lot of things I love about this cycle, and it's not that they're powerful for the record. So I love these mostly because they're these modal build-arounds, right? They do something based on a card type, which when you think about cards like this, you think about the young pyromancers of the world, the monastery mentors, the beast whisperers, the cards that care about having a density of a specific type of card in your deck. And we love build-arounds in Cube Design. We've talked about them a lot. I think it's really great to have a card that signals and pushes you strongly to evaluate cards differently. What I love about these is that they don't just fit into one kind of deck, right? Young pyromancer is great. If you don't have a density of cheap spells, then it can get kind of suspect, and you really just kind of put it in the one spell slingery kind of deck. Whereas here, you can take something like this white one, the Cemetery Protector, and this can go in a landfall deck. This can go in a green-white creature-based deck. This can go in a white-blue tempo deck if you wanted to, and it just turns into whatever you need it to be for that specific deck, which I think is especially great for Cube Design because we get to use this slot for a build-around without playing a super narrow card that doesn't do anything outside of the specific deck with which it's designed for, which I really, really like. I also like the way this mechanic actually works because, you can imagine a similar cycle of cards might just be, A white creature that enters the battlefield, you choose any card type from all the available card types, and then whenever you play a spell, you get a token. And this not only first gives you a little more interaction, because of course you're interacting with your opponent's graveyard or your own graveyard, so you have to like do a little bit of work to get that payoff. It's not just free. Then also you have this card in exile as a reminder of the thing you chose. You don't have to remember like, oh yeah, I chose instants with this. You actually have the physical card as a token, a reminder of the choice you made, which I think is a brilliant sort of small thing. I like that it's main deckable graveyard interaction in certain cubes if you care about interacting with the graveyard, but struggle to find main deckable grave hate, for lack of a better word. Like you said, this offers a lot of interesting decisions about, do you want to exile a thing from your opponent's graveyard that offers them the most value in their graveyard, the thing with a flashback or whatever, or do you want to exile the thing that is going to make this card more powerful because you know your opponent is going to play a lot more creatures and you want to, punish them for those creatures or whatever. They're a really beautiful cycle to me. I honestly, can you think of what are some other like modal build arounds you can even think of in Magic's history where it's like this card is a payoff, but you get to choose what it's a payoff for?
I am not prepared to answer that question.
Yeah, I kind of put you on the spot, but I was trying to think about it earlier today, and I really have a hard time thinking of any of them because they're so often designed with a specific deck in mind or a specific context in mind, and not this kind of like flexible space where you could choose the context you want for this build around or payoff card.
For sure. I don't think they're non-existent, but they are often maybe more niche cards that aren't great.
So yeah, I love this mechanic. My only gripe, and I wouldn't have done anything differently with this set of cards based on this gripe, but it is a bit annoying to me that it feels to me emotionally like instants and sorceries should be grouped together. Like if I care about casting spells and I play the white one and I have to choose instants or sorceries, that's kind of like, ugh. I feel like they should be grouped just because they're so often grouped in other mechanics. Obviously, it wouldn't make sense for them to be grouped, and so I think that's a little bit of a small complaint.
I think you're totally right, but I don't think that's a problem with this mechanic. I think it's a fundamental problem with Magic the Gathering.
You're getting on your high horse of your Mark Rosewater.
I'm not getting on my high horse.
Type.
I'm championing Mark Rosewater's revision of revisionist Magic the Gathering.
Yeah, I think honestly it would make more sense because they feel so similar, right? It's just a spell that has an effect. The only difference is the timing restriction. And so it's going to feel bad when you name sorcery and your opponent has instant speed removal for it or vice versa or whatever. I do want to make a specific note about the blue one, Cemetery Illuminator. This card is very interesting because it plays in this space a little differently than the others. So it has a static ability that lets you look at the top card of your library, and then you can cast the top card of your library if one of the exiled cards shares a type with it. Or you can also play land, so you can play the top card of your library. And this one, because that static ability is on the creature, it's on the body itself, you get to look at that top card before you choose what you exile from a graveyard on that ETB resolving. So you get to say, all right, look at my top card. Do I want to cast that this turn? If so, can I find something in another graveyard with this type on it so I can specifically get this value right now instead of like just kind of randomly exiling something and hoping the top card aligns with it. For the blue one, you get to trigger it as well when it attacks, exile more cards with it. So you can attack with knowledge of what the top card in your library is, choose what to exile, and then it just basically increases the opportunity for you to really get that value off of that blue creature with the future sight ability.
Yeah, there's an interesting tension sometimes in like, oh, I want to flip the top card of my library, and maybe it's what I need, and maybe I'll get lucky. But I feel like in a lot of cases, it's actually just more frustrating to not have access when it comes down to like these little incremental values. So I definitely appreciate that. I mean, Sagas is like the perfect example where they're saying, hey, this doesn't trigger during your upkeep like you would expect. Triggers after your draw step, so you sort of get that information you can plan your turn.
Is that something else you would errata if you could go back and redo Magic? Get rid of all these things that trigger on upkeep, have everything triggered at the beginning of the first main phase.
I think if I had to choose right now, I would say yes, but I definitely do agree that there are times where sort of like that, what are you going to hit is part of the excitement.
I do want to note that there are cards with similar themes and play patterns that show up in this set, the theme being exiling stuff from a graveyard for value. I'm thinking of cards like Fleeting Spirit, Patchwork Crawler, Cobbled Lancer, Kessig Wolf Rider. I'm sure there are others. So these are not the only cards in the set that are basically taking stuff from graveyards to gain some benefit, because it is, of course, set with Disturb. There's a lot of graveyard stuff going on, and so there's a fair amount of just graveyard interaction running throughout the set. There's one other card I noted in passing, Hiveheart Shaman, which makes note of card types. That particular one cares about basic land types. I don't know if it's actually similar in any kind of overarching design sense, but I did note that has a similar thing about caring about card types.
More broadly, I would just emphasize that, we talked about Cleave as like the headline mechanic for the set. And
is
there were, it's one of the like things they put in there.
Tokens.
One of. We got like 3.
Okay.
They mentioned Vow mechanics. It's like, yeah, we got blood tokens, we got Cleave, and something else. But really, I mean, if you look at the set and what the set is really about, it is very largely graveyard stuff. There's so much stuff, Disturb obviously cares about it. All of these sort of vampire things that are using, the graveyard as a resource. So if you're doing any kind of cube where that's something you're interested in, there's going to be a lot for you to find in this set.
Yeah, for me especially, my cube has gotten more and more graveyard focused over time. We'll talk more about this perhaps on our next episode, where we talk about our own additions from this set. And I'm excited to have more main deckable, like kind of incidental graveyard interaction. I'm not excited to run cards that just exile a graveyard, even if they would be playable. Like I think like a Relic of Progenitus would be perfectly playable in my cube as a card that just cycles for 2 and sometimes is very potent to get rid of graveyards. But I'm not thrilled about spending cube slots and deck slots on cards like that, even though they might be playable. I'm much more excited to play something like a Cemetery Gatekeeper, which can still exile the relevant card from your opponent's graveyard, but also is just a card in its own right that does stuff other than just cycling or that one specific sideboardy kind of effect. Other themes in this set, Anthony, I know there's a lot. We mentioned the kind of graveyard things. There's a lot of tribal themes in this set that are all kind of percolating. There's spirit tribal, wolf and werewolf tribal, zombie tribal, human tribal, and a little bit of vampire tribal. So for me, with tribal mechanics, when it comes to like reviewing them for broad consideration in like cubes and battle boxes and stuff, the thing that's always important to me is like there's kind of 2 sets of tribal mechanics in my mind. There are some tribes where their like thing that unites them is just the type line. It's just like, yep, this is just the thing that unites us. Like humans are all kind of smallish, I guess, creatures or whatever. There's always some kind of like flavor there, but there's so many humans who do so many different things. The human tribe is kind of just united by the fact that they're all humans. Then there are tribes that have like specific mechanical or gameplay identities. Like I think of zombies being this tribe that the mechanics that interact with zombies, the cards that interact with zombies are about this kind of like horde that just keeps coming back, and it's kind of this unending horde of like small creatures. And wizards, for example, have this kind of tribe where they have a lot of creatures with spell-like abilities associated with them that you can either activate or trigger on ETB or something. And so none of these tribes here seem to really have much of that mechanical flavor to me. They're really kind of mostly just held together by their type lines. Do you think I'm wrong? Do you think there's like a strong mechanical undertones to some of these tribes?
I mean, obviously, a tribal deck, when you're actually talking about an archetype, is not just about, I put a bunch of werewolves in a pile, and now this is my werewolf deck. Obviously, that's also fine. But it's about the payoffs. It's about the cards that actually care about, if you have enough werewolves, now you get a bonus. And there definitely are some payoffs. There's also a lot of kind of weird cards, which are definitely designed for limited in terms of like, well, this is the removal spell, and it's slightly more effective against vampires, and things like that, where I don't think that's going to make a lot of sense in cubes. So I think it is going to be kind of case by case. If you are already interested in these tribes, there's going to be more support, and there's a couple payoffs here and there. I would say that zombies and spirits and vampires, like they all are tribes that do kind of have a really strong mechanical theme. I mean, I'm a huge fan of zombies, and there are a couple here again that say, well, whenever you have a bunch of zombies, when they die, you draw cards, and they come back from the graveyards, and like all the cool stuff you expect zombies to give you. So I think there's definitely going to be a deep well for all of those. I think vampires also have an interesting space where a lot of them care about whenever you gain life or whenever your opponent loses life, and that sort of like idea of doing incremental damage and incremental drain of your opponent. And I think that's pretty deep. There's actually a very, very deep sort of life gain matters theme in this set. So I think if you're interested in those themes, and especially the overlap with vampire tribal, there's a lot of space there.
Could blood tokens have just like gained a life?
That's if you had told me this is a blood token, what do you think it does? I would have said, yeah, gains you a life, or more importantly, because we have food already, I would have said your opponent loses a life, you gain a life. But here we are.
If it just did that though, without also rummaging, it would be a little too simple for me to be excited about it. Like of all those kind of card types, food is definitely the one I'm least excited about. I think Lifegain is kind of. Oh boy, how to
I'm not saying
this.
I don't love blood tokens. I would love if blood tokens drained your opponent. And
you want a different
also
name thing.
Had.
You want this to be called like the.
I want them to be called clue tokens.
Well,
and then we need
tough, buddy.
The clue tokens need to get shifted over to the draw discovery token.
Thesaurus for clue. Yeah, I don't know. Lifegain is just. It's never been my favorite mechanic. It's kind of just like slow down the game without really advancing your game plan. Obviously, this is absent like a life gain matters kind of theme where you have cards that trigger on life gain, but that could be anything, right? Like the cards that trigger when something happens, that something could be anything you want. I don't love when it's life gain. I like when it's other stuff, because stuff that actually advances the game instead of just stalling,
So I do actually think that they've been doing a really good job in the last couple sets or at least the last couple sets where there have been Lifegain, which has not been too infrequent, where they haven't really been this, it's a wall that gains you a bunch of life and you just sit behind it. But they are proactive cards that, it's creatures with lifelink, it's creatures that gain life when they attack, it's creatures that get bigger when you gain life. So they are sort of putting you in this situation where you're definitely, you can only take advantage of that kind of life gain matters by being proactive and actually trying to end the game. You're not just putting up a pillow fort and trying to gain enough life to get out of reach of your opponent. So I think that especially in the last couple of years, if you're interested in exploring that kind of like proactive life gain, there's a ton of space. And we see in the set, there's a new Johnny's Pridemate even that gets wild and does crazy stuff.
Johnny's Pridemate's gone wild. You give those cats a t-shirt, they'll give you the whole world.
Yikes.
Give me your 10,000 foot overview. How do you feel about the set? Do you like the set? Dislike the set? What do you think of it?
I think we should talk about one more theme.
Oh, hit me.
So the last theme I would mention is enchantments. Enchantments are another space where lots of decks can care about an enchantment that does what the deck is about. But again, if it's like an enchantment as a mechanical archetype, you need to care about enchantments. And that's another pretty
And we can
deep
agree
theme.
enchantments are the worst card type, right?
I like all of them.
I mean, maybe tribal, if you want to call tribal a card.
Yes.
type or whatever.
Yes, you're totally right. Tribal.
Taking tribal out, the kind of ugly runt of the litter of card types, I think enchantments is the worst.
Tribal's confusing. We should talk about that on another episode. I think I agree, but I still like enchantments. And I think a lot of Cube designers, or I think a lot of Magic players, enjoy playing with enchantments.
Yeah, sure.
It's fun to do like an Enchantress deck every once in a while. And like we were talking about with the Disturb creatures that come back as enchantments, we have this other way to sort of add a bunch of enchantments into your deck without actually lowering the creature count, which makes a lot of sense, a lot of context. So this is, again, another theme that I think, there's more of it here than there is of Cleave, so I would consider that one of the major themes of this set, that if you're trying to bake in enchantments into your cube, look here.
Look at that full spoiler. All right, now,
give
me your overall impression. Did these two sets, even we could even throw a little bit of Midnight Hunt in here, did these two sets do Innistrad justice to you?
I think in terms of, if we're talking about doing justice to the plane, then sure, we're definitely capturing the flavor. We're getting back away from the weird Eldrazi horror was maybe a bit of
I like that
bit of a shakeup for many people.
I like that one a lot.
I think you might be in the minority there, especially when it comes to not necessarily the Eldrazi in a big picture, but as far as their impact on Innistrad was, I think, not for a lot of people. And I think I tend to agree. I do kind of like the little touch of here and there. There's a seagull with a weird Eldrazi face, or a beast in the woods with an extra mouth. From just a mechanical perspective, I think this fits into sort of the same pattern that we see with a lot of, these sets that are obviously designed to be played in a lot of ways. And one of the big ways is limited. And a lot of those mechanics are dependent on having a certain volume of things, or they're, really leaning into, they're adding some complexity for the sake of flavor. So mechanics like Cleave and, the transform cards, I think a lot of these are not things that are going to make it into a lot of my cubes. I think some people might feel similarly, but at the same time, I do think there is a ton of depth, again, in terms of the enchantments matter and the life gain matters and other sort of one-off cards, that there's going to be a lot to offer for all kinds of cubes here.
I haven't played the set yet. We're recording this before pre-release, but to me, this set, I think, was a little bit disappointing. I feel like training feels weird and out of place here. I know not all the mechanics can be Innistrad-y, spooky graveyard mechanics, but that one feels a little weird to me. Cleave is extremely weird, totally out of left field, doesn't really have anything to do with the plane at all. And then the main graveyard mechanics being Disturb and Blood tokens, which essentially is a way to get cards into your graveyard. I feel like Blood tokens would make so much more sense in a set with Madness or other more substantial reasons, flashback to be discarding cards. I mean, Disturb is kind of the one we have here, which is fine. I don't know. I think this kind of fell a little bit short in terms of mechanics to the high bar that Innistrad set. I love the flavor of Shadows over Innistrad. I thought it was a great shake-up of the iconic Gothic horror trope to mix in this H.P. Lovecraft Eldritch horror into there. I thought that was kind of fun. Here we're just kind of I think you're right that maybe the response was tepid to that or middling, and so we're kind of just back on normal Gothic horror flavor without any additional interest added in. I do like the set piece of a big wedding. I think that's cool. I like that we got a wedding dress and a wedding invitation as magic cards. I'd like to see that kind of branching out, but overall it's not my favorite set, but I do have some cards I'm excited about for my own cube, which we'll talk about next week.
I mean, I think that would be, you're sort of saying blood tokens would fit with all these other mechanics, and I totally agree, but I think that's just Wizards stepping back a little and saying, hey, we could do the easy thing. We could put flashback in here. We could do all these things.
Yeah, everyone would love it.
We're going to leave that to the cube designers, so build it
Instead,
yourself.
Cleave. Have this Cleave. We have flashback at home. You see some sort of Cleave monstrosity card. All right. Like I said, tune in next week for Anthony and I reviewing the set for our own context and cubes. That should be an exciting episode where we get to languish in our own cube design theories and philosophies and just focus on what matters to us. And then following that, maybe not the week directly after, but at some point afterwards will be the community set review. So make sure you go to luckypaper.co/survey/VOW and fill out that survey. Let us know what you're testing from the set. Anthony made a couple other small improvements to the survey, as he does most of the times the survey comes out. We've simplified it a little bit, made it even easier to fill out, so go check out that survey. And also, send in your hot takes. I didn't request them for the last set, I think because I partially forgot, and then after I forgot, I was just too burned out by all the different sets that have been released in recent history, but we are still accepting hot takes. So if you want to have your opinion about some card entered into the permanent record on Lucky Paper Radio, just send us a voice memo with 30 seconds of whatever your hot take about the set or a specific card from the set is, and we'll put it on the show, unless it's offensive or something, and then we won't. We reserve the right not to put anything on the show if we don't want to. This has been Lucky Paper Radio. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This show is produced by me and Anthony, who sit in his basement and talk about Magic on microphones once a week. Thanks for doing that, Anthony.
Thank you for coming all the way over to my basement.
It's a full 6-minute walk.